Thank you for the opportunity to talk about the healing spirit at Signature Healthcare. So, new resident comes into room 50, Pastor Scott in Memphis. He goes down like he normally does in the morning, goes to the new residents' rooms, knock, knock, knock. Pastor Scott here. Yeah, thanks, don't want any, thanks. Next day, same thing, he goes, visits, knock, knock, knock. Pastor Scott here. Yeah, thanks. That's okay. Week, 10 days, same thing goes on. The resident gets admitted to the local hospital for a procedure. Pastor Scott, sitting at his desk, gets a phone call from the resident's father and says, "My daughter would like to see you. Can you come over and see her?" So he says, "Sure, I'll be there in a few minutes, it's close." So he gets ready to go knock on the door at the hospital, and the dad is coming out, and he says, "She wants to talk to you." Next 2 hours, she unpacks her life, talking about things that she did, she shouldn't have done, and just all various things that went on. But the thing that stuck in his mind the most was the way she left home in a way that we would hope potentially the children wouldn't leave home at a young age, and that a few months later her mother died and they never got to heal and never got to do anything. So Pastor Scott was able to listen to her and hear that journey and then say, can't do anything about yesterday, but what can you do now to move forward? And so began that journey of that healing spirit. He's getting ready to leave and he says, one question, why'd you call me? And she says, because you never gave up and you kept coming back. Another city, another chaplain, Chaplain Charles. He's walking down the hallway and he sees a family member coming up the hallway, doesn't recognize, reaches out, "Hey, I'm Chaplain Charles." She says, "I'm Doris. My husband's down in room 23. He says, "Great, I'll get down and see him a little bit later." She says, "Yeah, you might not want to do that. He doesn't like religion." And so he says, "Well, that's okay. What does he like? What's his hobbies?" And comes to find out he's an avid, likes history. He says, "Great, I love history." So he goes down later that afternoon and starts introducing himself and says, "Chaplain Charles here." He says, "Yeah, thanks, I'm okay." He says, "Yeah, I get that, but I hear you like history. I don't get enough people to talk to history about. Can you come in?" And so they talk. So the next 2 weeks, while this gentleman's there for a short stay, they have regular conversations about history. And then, of course, through that, they talk about some of life's journeys and some of those transitions that he's been through. And it ends up being a good thing. Another city, another time, another chaplain. Resident is in a weekly reflection time. And the family's decided that mom's going to have to stay in the facility, can't go home at this point. And so what are they doing? They're selling her possessions. And so that is hitting her that now I'm not going back because they're selling my possessions. And so the reflection is on purpose and wherever you are in your journey, finding that purpose in life and how can God help you through that. And she begins talking about losing her possessions and how depressed she is about this. And so through the discussion, they start talking about big G God, right, purpose, who I am, and little g God, those things that we look for where we're trying to get value in. And through the discussion, they talk a little bit more about purpose wherever you are and whatever that point of that journey that you're on. And you could see a difference in her face before the thing is over. She says, "I feel better." And the next day, there's a noticeable difference in her face and the way she's lit up because she let go of those things that are the past, right? And so she feels a different purpose. So it's about she heard me. So those are different examples of different chaplains. And whether you call them a chaplain or a spiritual director or a life coach, it doesn't matter. It's how are we helping people find purpose in where they are in that transition. I'm going to talk a little bit about the signature journey Joe Steyer, our president and CEO, when his fourth child was born, his wife and son were grave condition, it's preemie. And so he's spending time in the hospital chapel down there praying, asking for his wife and son to come through this. And you can imagine the number of texts and phone calls the guy's getting and emails, praying for you, thinking about you, love you, all that happens to him. He's the president of the company, right? And he is, his wife and son came out of that and everything's okay. But when that event's over, he's thinking, that's not very fair that I get that. Why can't everybody get that same support during those transitional and difficult times? So we ultimately grew and went to full-time chaplains in most of the buildings, and that became a part of who we are. But like many organizations, we got hit with financial difficulties over the last few years, right? Some of that challenge we've gone through. So we've had to rethink what that looks like and what chaplaincy looks like, or spirituality, and it might be shared buildings and different things in that area. But the mission is still the same. How are you meeting people at a point of need? How are you there for that transition for the family and various types of events? So what does a post-acute chaplain look like? And so if we've never had a chaplain or spiritual director, whatever term you want to use, in your building, that could be something a little bit different to have. But they could really drive your reputations in the community. So when patients or residents go back for a return to hospital, they can certainly go to the hospital and meet them and talk to them and help them through that transition and that challenge that they're going through at that point. In some markets, depends upon your market, you can go do those visits before the admission. You know, you have a potential admission list, and of course that depends upon your market. But Ronnie, down in our South Central Tennessee facility, he goes to the potential admission. So he goes into one resident's or patient's room with the daughter, and they're talking about, he says, introducing himself, who he is, and he understands he's there just to listen. And they're talking about how mom's really not doing well, and we're just going to probably call in hospice. So he lets them talk, and he listens, and lets them go through that transition that they're going through. Week goes by as he's making his visits. 2 weeks goes by, and mom, you can see a little glow starting to come out, a little bit of hope coming back out of it. She ends up coming to the facility. 2 months later, discharges, walking out of the building. And so was able to be there at that time of transition, that time of need. Whether she ever came to the building or not, that wasn't his purpose. He was there because somebody needed something during a difficult time, and that's what he was all about. As you can imagine, when people pass in the buildings, a lot of times they're asked to do funerals of somebody that passed. And it's not uncommon that a year, 2 years, the family will call back and say, hey, my sister's died, or I have an uncle that's passed, and they'll ask them to do that funeral. Because for a lot of people, this is their version of spirituality and all the spirituality they might have in any faith tradition that they might have. So they're really involved in those transitional times in people's lives, bringing that healing spirit to whatever event people are going to. There you go, think about this. I know when our employees have personal issues at home, we never say, oh, leave that at the door, right? When you come in here, you're a caregiver. You can't bring that in here. And how real is that for people to do that when they're having potential issues with marriage or finances or things, and are they really coming in whole to deal with that? So that chaplain, spiritual director can be a great voice for those people and for our employees. Can't do anything about yesterday. Yesterday's gone, right? You have something, a deck of cards that's handed you today. What are you going to do about it? What steps are you going to do to move forward with what you've got in your life today? And so they can help them during that time. They can help healing of our stakeholders, our employees, during some type of trauma that they're dealing with. Irma, we had multiple buildings down in Florida with Irma coming up. So you can imagine that the stress, you know, TV for a week is saying, you got, you know, a hurricane the size of Texas is coming up and going to hit the coast, and so how much anxiety does that put on people as they're getting ready to live through that, right? And then to go through that, and I went down and helped on some Irma evacuations in some of our buildings, and I know for me, it was 10 days to 2 weeks before I started sleeping well after going through that. So that's tough stuff to deal with. But there's other types of traumas. You have a nurse aide who loves a resident who falls and breaks an arm, right? And so that hurts them as much as it hurts the resident. And maybe they're thinking in their head, wonder if I could have done something different to prevent this. And so that trauma is hitting our employee as it relates to that. I'm not a nurse, but I couldn't imagine what it would be like if you're having to do compressions on somebody that didn't do the end of the life discussions, and you hear those bones cracking as you're doing that compression, right? I wonder if any of those events, how well do you sleep? And so the chaplain spiritual director can be there during that time of trauma that our employees are going through and those difficulties that they're there for. So they're for residents, families, and the employees. We did like all of us, we're having difficulty keeping people, so we did a director of nursing retention survey. And we asked them an open question. What 3 things should we continue doing that would make you want to stay or entice you to stay? And slightly under 50% of them mentioned one of the values that we espouse, whether it's our Sacred 6 values or whether it's you know, and they specifically mentioned the chaplain and the spirituality. And so when you're thinking about the different things that we could do, how do we really embed those values in what we are? And so the nursing staff really appreciates what that brings to the table. I want to talk a little bit about the balance if you're thinking about going with bringing spirituality into your workplace and you're recruiting. What type of person are you looking for? Having a person of a faith tradition can be very beneficial, obviously, because they would tend to lean towards a spirituality as a general rule. The challenge is that they have to be very clear it's not proselytizing. Our job here is not to try to convert anybody to anything. It's not about religion at all, because we have people of many faith traditions and people with no faith tradition. But how do you meet them at that time of need with that healing spirit to help them through where they're going? Can't put spirituality in a box. It's, you know, unlike a therapist, you know, where therapists, you got to track that time as you're going on down. You can't really dictate and put that spirituality in a box because they have to have flexibility to be able to listen in what's going on and get where they need to be. But don't be vague about it either, because there are certain things that they can do that brings purpose to your people and purpose to your community and the people that they're serving. Some people will stiff-arm spirituality because they think it's religion. It's nothing really about religion at all. There's a lot of research today, if you want to Google it, about mindfulness and the value that mindfulness brings to people and gratefulness and having a grateful spirit. So you could Google all of that research. A hero's journey, there's a lot of stuff in there that you can look at that really helps going where you are. So what can happen if you bring spirituality in your workplace? We know the whirlwind is tough. We've heard the other presenters talk about the challenges that we have with, you know, you got to make numbers, you have salary, wages that you've got to get in, you got to get staff. All that whirlwind that we have every day trying to keep the business afloat, right? And so it's so easy to get caught into that. But your spirituality team and your people can help really bring a sense of gratefulness for the little things that happens to avoid adaptation. And adaptation is the big roadblock to having a grateful spirit. Adaptation is nothing more than taking things for granted. How important is it that every day the med cart gets locked? How important every day is it that somebody comes down the hallway with a smile on their face? How important is it every day that this nurse does a good job on the admissions paperwork, right? Those little things every day that make the life the way it is. And so getting that culture of looking for and thanking and recognizing those little things that we don't take for granted. And then it makes employees comfortable with values. Whatever your values are that as you talk about them all the time, it really becomes an important part. This picture is a good picture. I'd mentioned I went down to Florida and helped with Irma. So I was in a building, walking down the hallway, going to do something at the other end of the building. And I come around the corner, and this is what I see. And so they're there praying for their families that they're getting ready to leave as they go with residents 3 hours away, being evacuated up to Orlando. And they're praying for the residents, and they're praying for everybody that's going to be involved with that. And so they embrace it as a way that helps who they are and builds that family amongst them, creates this servant leadership mindset. At the end of the day, it is about our residents and our families that we're serving at a time of need. But it also is a way to really heal the healer. I mentioned to you earlier, the first person I talked about was Scott Payne, who did the knocking on the door. Last fall, I was doing his evaluation. I said, so how's this year been for you? He says, you know, I was a 42-year pastor at a big church, planted a church and grew it to 2,500 members. And he says, I was around people that thought like me, people that reinforced the way I was thinking and believed like me. And he says, when I retired and I became a chaplain, I learned something different. I'm around people that aren't like me, people that don't think like me. I'm around people of different orientations that I would have never been around before. And he said, I'm more of a man now than I've ever been by getting out. And so that's a matter of how do we break down barriers. And so when we really want to embrace spirituality and who the person is, it breaks down that dualistic thinking, right? That this or that thinking. How can I really be open to who you are, where you are, and what's going on? The journeys we all have called life, right? It's up and down and up and down and up and down. And those downs can be pretty down, right? And so that's where your spiritual team can help you really get into that. Those downs are life's lessons if I'm willing to understand what's got me here and to reflect differently about where I am, because now all I have to do is decide what's happening moving forward. What can I do to move forward? And so that healing spirit is something that happens to all of us, for our residents, our employees, families, where we're meeting them in life's journeys. Thank you. Have a great day.